Hello, welcome back to another episode of Somewhere Between a Film and TV podcast. I am your host, Daniel Para. Number one, thank you so much for listening and watching. Number two, if you could, please down below, let me know what you thought of Fantastic Four: The First Steps. Go ahead and like, comment, and subscribe as well. Let's go ahead and get right into it. Fantastic Four: The First Steps is directed by Matt Shakman and is about, as we know, the titular Fantastic Four as they kind of go in a new endeavor into Earth 828 instead of what we know as the MCU in their original universe. So before I get into everything, I just want you to know that everything that I review will always have full spoilers. But going into this, I feel like personally the Fantastic Four, with the adaptations before, whether it have been the Tim Story films or the really, really terrible one by Josh Trank, which did have a lot of studio interference, but at the end of the day was the movie that it was, and it was absolutely one of the worst comic book movies ever made. And the Tim Story ones, I feel like they have their place, kind of. I like the chemistry between Jessica Alba, and I believe his name was Ian Grafad, and Chris Evans is a great Johnny Storm, but to this day, or till this day, I felt like Fantastic Four was seemingly really hard to adapt. Incredibles 1 and 2, which I know some people feel about, but I love that movie, by Brad Bird, seemed to be the best adaptation of Fantastic Four, of that family dynamic, the whole nuclear Mad Men inspired fusion. And going into this, I believe that it was originally intended to be directed by Peyton Reed, but then of course Ant-Man Quantumania came out, one of my personal least favorite films in the MCU, and the trailer had come out, and I know so many people had so many different things to say. Pedro Pascal's everywhere, why is he in everything now? Why is Joseph Quinn from Stranger Things Johnny Storm? But I thought that at the end of it all, of course you have to wait until you see the movie. And with this movie, you got to ask, and I got to ask you guys as well, did you love it? Did you hate it? Or are you somewhere between on it? And for me, myself, I loved this movie. I thought that it was visually creative. It was dazzling. It's one of the most impressive movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, cinematography-wise, I felt. I thought that they did such a great job specifically with the art direction. If you look up Art Deco 60s retro futurist inspired, you're going to see the exact set design here that they went with. And that's really what separated it so much from the other MCU films. I know that some people said that they might not be on track, that they didn't love some of the stuff from beforehand. Me personally, I felt like they never quite lost their footing. I thought some stuff was definitely not as great as the other stuff, and they definitely had a bit more hit or misses in terms of how to describe their output lately. Captain America Brave New World was obviously the product of Disney Plus era, where Kevin Feige was so busy with everything that he was working on that you could just tell that he didn't have time to really moderate every single piece of work. Daredevil I loved personally, and I felt was only victim of that in the sense that the final couple episodes felt so much different from the initial setup of the season. And of course you find out that's literally quite exactly what happened. But then this year, after Brave New World came out, Thunderbolts I loved so much. I thought it was a huge breath of fresh air. I thought it was the Marvel Cinematic Universe sort of taking on a theme that they could finally handle in terms of all of them dealing with stuff mentally, in terms of their mental health, and in terms of depression with Yelena, and a lot of them feeling like they couldn't quite reach above with what they were. And then we saw at the end credits of that the Fantastic Four come in, and remember that everything, like I said, will always have full spoilers, so touching on that leading into this, you would think, oh, okay, I think that the way that this ends, at least my projected theory, which is why you never go in hoping that what you're theorizing is true and you always critique the movie that you actually see, is that whenever they're arguing that they're the new Avengers and Thunderbolts, that you see them come down into Earth, that we think that, oh, okay, so at the end of the Fantastic Four movie that they're going to go ahead and go to Earth. They're gonna, maybe they lost their universe, whatever it may be, and that's really not what happens here. Actually, we're going to touch on the positives and the negatives, but I'm going to go ahead and get the mid-credit scene out of the way first, because for a while there with Marvel, that was arguably the most important thing. Now we're back to, we got to tell the good story in order to get people interested, which is exactly what you want. That's what you want a franchise to do. So by the end of it, let's break down the mid-credit scene first, and what happens is we are introduced to Franklin Richards, which is Sue Storm and Mr. Fantastic's kid, Reed Richards, and that's Franklin. And we see that he's being held by who we can only assume is Robert Downey Jr.'s Doctor Doom at the end of it. At least the side profile was super cool, because that's all you see in terms of the mask design, in terms of the cloak, everything. They'd already been hinting at him within the context of the movie. Early on, you can see a lot of, union meetings, and they keep kind of showing that Latveria, which I believe is how it's pronounced, the representative is missing, which if you know essentially. And by the end of it, of course, we see that Vanessa Kirby's character Sue Storm walks in, and you see him holding Franklin, and that's about it. That's essentially what the end credit scene is. The other one is silly. It's just the Fantastic Four cartoon playing, which I liked a lot. It reminded me a lot of the one from Spider-Man Homecoming with the in-universe media with Captain America in the gym thing. It was definitely a similar sort of vibe, but I think the reason why the end credit scene itself worked for me was because I personally don't go to all the Marvel movies to just see the end credit scene, see what's set up later, because then you're never going to get the payoff that you want for the actual movie you're watching. And so with that out of the way, the movie itself, again, directed by Matt Shakman, who was the creative lead and director for WandaVision, a show that I loved back when I personally felt like Disney Plus was on a high with their Marvel shows. I loved it. I loved Captain America in the Winter Soldier, or Falcon in the Winter Soldier, but it does the title change thing at the end, kind of like how Thunderbolts does. And honestly, breaking down why I loved this movie so much is it is self-contained. I really respected that about it a lot. I thought it was a very smart idea to take them into Earth 828, which, as we learn at the end of it, is a reference to, I believe, Jack Kirby's date of birth, or it might have been passing, but either or, it was a reference to Jack Kirby, which is brilliant because, of course, he had a lot in the hands of these characters. Galactus specifically, that's always been his whole thing, was the more cosmic side of things. And for me, part of what I loved so much about all of this was its self-contained nature, really focusing on the family dynamic between all of them. The sizzle reel idea to be introduced through, I think it's Ted Gilbert, the in-universe host for their world, was really cool because it cuts straight open into it. You are basically dropped into it. It reminded me so much of Superman in that way, where it's like, this is the world. We spent so much time in reality, our reality, trying to make superheroes be adapted into the world that we live in. Now I feel like, since the era of the kind of grim, dark sort of superhero adaptation is over, where it was, and I like Zack Snyder's movies, and I will defend them even, but the really dark, dour sort of stuff, outside of the Batman, which the Batman goes for this really kind of gothic, Halloween looking and feeling aesthetic, same goes for the Penguin to an extent, but that's more the crime, grungy part of it. We can still have that stuff. But now, I thought moving it into a quite literal different world, and I really want to break down the aesthetic itself before we even get into the plot. I felt like the visuals were so inspired, just in terms of, I thought that Thunderbolts looked amazing, but the cinematography for this was so clearly, I really felt like it was storyboarded. While something like Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania, you kind of feel like, hey, we have to have this action scene. It was already done in previs, but you gotta film the stuff around it so we can piece this all together. This felt like it was storyboarded in terms of concept art, in terms of shots alone. There's one that's so simple where it's just Reed and he's writing stuff on a chalkboard, and while he's writing that stuff, there's also a light shining down on him, because it's also kind of a conflict in terms of what's going on within the context of the movie, that they have this dilemma with their son. And I miss that sort of cinematography. I think that there was this sort of realistic aesthetic that movies, just generally speaking, were trying to go with for so long, that we kind of forgot that we can make things creative and visually interesting. For all you can say about Jurassic World Rebirth, a movie I didn't even love, but I had a good time with, I felt like it genuinely took an approach to shoot things in a certain way, and I felt like it looked different from other recent blockbusters. And now I kind of feel like this Superman was so distinct in look. And I know that unfortunately Fantastic Four came out, like a week or two after that did. It's unfortunately going to get compared to Superman, and I'm not going to say which one do I prefer over the other, because I love them both. And one of the issues is they both take the Silver Age 60s aesthetic and are heavily inspired by it. So it's going to have some comparisons. But from set design alone to, there's this really clever thing that they do where they record things that are kind of cassette based, but on like vinyls. And you see them recording the message over and over. And Johnny Storm has his own player, which has this really sort of rounded out blue aesthetic to it, and he has the headphones connected to it. It's got this really kind of, it's definitely articulated in a very specific way where it felt grounded in its own world, but they also simultaneously, you're in a world with something like The Thing in Fantastic Four and Silver Surfer, where they'll be doing simple stuff, like they'll even be cooking in their kitchen that looks so much like the Jetsons. And the Thing is talking to Herbie, their robot, and you'll see that the robot itself has this specific face that's kind of also a cassette, and it's brilliant. And I think that usually stuff like that I've been kind of cynical about lately. I've been like, oh, okay, so this specific type of look, this specific type of vibe, the robot itself. There's always a side character that you gotta have the merch for, you gotta have the toy for, and of course I fell victim to it just because the character design was so brilliant. I want that like $80 popcorn bucket that AMC is selling right now. It's just genuinely such a cool design, and the way it interacts with everybody throughout the movie. It has a genuine character of its own. It does remind you kind of like, you know, K2SO, or honestly more to an extent the robot from Interstellar, which this movie shares more DNA with than you might think, to be entirely honest with you. But breaking that down and moving into the characters themselves, the reason why you end up caring about superhero adjacent, superhero related things is because, of course, there's a kind of fantastical element to it where, you know, you want the powers. I love, let's say, Sky High, and you're like, I would want this person's power. I would want this person's power. Out of all these four, I'm definitely a Human Torch, Johnny Storm person. And I think that it's not just the way in which the powers are utilized, it's also the casting. I think that casting Pedro Pascal, who, let's admit it, is everywhere right now. And I'm going to be honest though, I love him as an actor. I think that he brings a really distinct charm and charisma to every role that he's in. And let's say something like Materialist from earlier this year, I liked a lot, and I actually felt sort of subdued him to an extent, which is kind of funny that I say that, because then I see this one and they subdue his charm on purpose. But the thing about that is he has a sort of inkling under his eyes of sadness. He's a good enough actor that you can tell that the character he's playing has something that he's sort of withholding from people at all times, even without the context of what he's withholding in this movie. And eventually he admits it. He says, my job is to finally, he finally says this, he says, my job is to always think the worst outcome of everything, to have that burden. And Sue Storm says, no, that's just you as a person, which is why I love that these characters were in their own world. It's because I feel personally like you can do so much depth exploration. And honestly, if we're going to get into negatives, like I'm just going to say one of them right now, and I love this movie a lot, is that I could have taken so much more of that. This movie's like an hour 55. It could have been longer. Honestly, it maybe should have been longer. I know they cut a bunch of stuff. John Malkovich isn't even in this movie, and he's in the trailer. And Paul Walter Hauser, who's amazing in the 3 scenes he's in as Mole Man, also felt like there was more there. But what we got was so great and definitely didn't feel just surface level. It felt more like we are just breaking the surface and we're going to get so much more into these people in the future. And that's exactly the type of exploration in an origin movie that you want. And what I respected a lot about this, much like Superman, was that there wasn't really necessarily any kind of origin of any sort here. We're sort of thrown into the depths of them in the middle of an adventure already. And the whole play on words here. This is called Fantastic Four, the First Steps. Obviously, the early on set piece, which I'm going to get into in a second because it's brilliant, with giving birth to Franklin, his first steps, which is kind of funny because he never actually, takes them in this movie. But then it also triples as them whenever they were first going into space and they were, the ones taking the first steps. I'm sure whoever came up with the subtitle for this genuinely, maybe they got a raise. They feel like they deserved a raise. Either way, it's a brilliant title, even down to it where sometimes you feel like movies that, blockbusters specifically, they had a first draft, a second draft, or somebody just told them the movie that they wanted them to write. And here I really felt like this was scripted out. 1 act, 2 act, 3 act, even though I feel like the second act kind of isn't really in this. It feels like it goes from 1 act to third act. Like it kind of launches to 100. And I think it's just because of the pacing of the movie itself. But I thought that Pedro Pascal really played that character very well, and I want to see so much more of him. He's very much the archetype that his comic book character is. He's genuinely so smart and burdened by the idea that he's smart. But he's also kind of not dumb, but they say it a few separate times. And this is also a joke that I think works in the 2005 one of all things, where it's like, that's the world's dumbest smart man. And it's mostly just to the extent that this one also has jokes like that I think are funny, where they're like, did you pass your driver's test? And he's like, no, that's because of poorly marked signage, probably like alluding to, a stop sign that he couldn't see or anything like that, which I think is, very, very clever and smart as just even an in-joke world building thing, which is really cool because you can also see they kind of have it reminded me of Chicken Little of all things, where they have the cars that have the kind of domes over them that the Jetsons also had. But that, and then I think Sue Storm really actually genuinely carries the theming of the movie itself here. I think that obviously it's about family, and much like the Fast and Furious movies, but I think that her whole burden is also understanding that Reed would also consider making this move. She says that sometimes him being him is the biggest burden about him, and their whole sort of dilemma with each other is brilliant because of how it plays into also being a superhero. That, ties into how that inspired things like My Hero Academia, and I sort of joked about this, but I do love this movie Sky High to an extent, is let's say you're a superhero, but you also have to deal with family matters in world, but you're also doubling as a team of superheroes. How do you navigate something like that? The entire central conflict of this movie was so unique and interesting. It sort of felt like something, I texted a friend because I love One Piece so much, and so does he, and Luffy's back there, but some of it felt a little bit One Piece coded to me. Even some of the Galactus stretching Reed felt a lot like something that Luffy would find himself in that world, honestly. But the entire conflict that Franklin is either going to be given to Galactus or they have to give up their world. It asks the moral dilemma. If you were to be asked to give up your own kid that you just had with your husband or with your wife in order to save the world that you live in, how are you going to go about that? And then, of course, they land down on Earth, and after, it's like the most stressful part of the movie is the interstellar Silver Surfer sequence that I'm still going to break down in a second. They handle that press conference so just like we just told them the truth, and then everybody's mad at them, and I thought that was such a brilliant way to go about that, because that being the central conflict of the movie, there's so many movies about the world coming to an end. There's so many movies about this is the end of the world. But instead of handling it just as Galactus is going to eat the planet, it's more sort of like we have two options, and it's either giving up the sun we just had that we love, or we give up the world. And there's a brilliant line where they say something about moving heaven and earth. And there's a couple of things here where it's kind of funny, because you feel like the person who wrote this definitely felt like Human Torch to an extent, where they're catching themselves on fire because they feel like what they just wrote was like so awesome, but it was actually. And another one is a scene that I loved that really boiled down to Pedro Pascal's character, where they're doing the montage, they're doing that sort of like 60s throwback aesthetic that I really liked a lot, that they even committed to it, to the bit, to doing it all the way to the montages as well, where he has a one-on-one just to his son, and he's saying something along the lines of, a lot of dads, a lot of parents say that they want their kids to follow in their footsteps. They want them to be like them. But he was like, the more I look at you, the more scared I get. And he says, I don't want you to be anything like me. And it's essentially along the lines of saying, like, I want you to be your own person. And humanizing a character to that extent is genuinely why I ended up falling in love with this movie so much. I respect that so hard. And I think that there's other movies that, the MCU in the past has kind of struggled with having, a central theme at all. But here it's so much more than just, family is important. They all have their own dilemmas going on. And the one thing that I think could have used more work and more depth for me, if we're going to go ahead and get into a negative that I have, is a character I loved a lot and I actually think stole the show. And I love Ebon-Moss-Bachrach, especially since I just finished The Bear season 4. The Thing has one really beautiful moment, and it's in the trailer, where he is watching his past self in a reflection bouncing back on him, and it's him in his human form. And of course you see the sadness in his eyes as well. And then he sort of, in that scene, pivots and looks at Natasha Lyonne's character that he's introduced to, who's, by the way, if I'm going to mention one random other negative, that's only because I like that actress so much, is that she's barely in this and should have been in it quite a bit more. And he looks at her from across the way and sort of feels like he can't have something that other people can have. And I genuinely feel like The Thing, as that specific type of character, has so much to him, and I just want more of it. I felt like they gave Sue a lot to do. They gave Pedro Pascal's Reed Richards a lot to do in terms of emotional depth. And The Thing starts, but I definitely don't know if it gets there in the end of it, just in terms of his full exploration of his character. But that's also because this movie's an hour 55, which also respect to that, but I think that it should have been a bit longer. I can take Marvel movies being just as long as they want to be. Honestly, I mean, like, I loved Eternals, and that movie's very long. And if we're talking about one other character that I loved a lot, was Joseph Quinn as Johnny Storm. In the Chris Evans portrayal, he's amazing as that character. I kind of give those movies a little bit of a pass, if I'm being honest, but he's definitely, let's say, a genuinely great thing about them. But he's obviously a jackass in them. He's a very, like, early 2000s, listens to Sum 41 and, X Games, like, skis, snowboards, all those things. They took that and did the bit more of the kind of like 60s poster boy. Quite literally, he's the Coppertone ad in this at some point, which they even go to that extent. Times Square in this, I want to pause that and be able to look around. They have this one ad for Little Caesars of all places that I really liked, and I know they have a partnership with them, but still, that was really funny. But they even show that he's this kind of like poster boy, and they say that he's a flirt, but it's kind of there's only one woman that he really interacts with that's not his sister, and it's Silver Surfer. And I really liked their dynamic with each other, actually, because he's not just, hitting on her. He has a genuine sort of interest in who she is as a person and as a being. But I really, really want to know where they're going with him, because I like that they made him a different kind of jerk. They made him immensely likable, much like Chris Evans, but he also has an extreme sort of heart that he gives the Thing shit, but that's sort of their thing with each other, and they have that back and forth. But what I also liked so much about him is like he is definitively a hothead. That's quite literally his character, and it's portrayed in his powers. But breaking down, it's kind of funny because I mentioned in a TikTok that I'd made for the channel that I don't need a bunch of action scenes to really carry me through an action film or a superhero movie. And this one really only has, I think, like 2. And that's the one towards the end with Galactus, but then there's also the one in the beginning with Silver Surfer. And that one was brilliant. It was so tense. It was really, really well conceived, pun aside, as a, beginning to end action set piece. It felt sort of like, how sometimes you say something in a positive way, it feels like a roller coaster. It felt so much like that, like the Guardians of the Galaxy ride at Epcot, even, where really catapulting from her surfing in the lava on wherever they were, like some sort of planet that Galactus stations himself on, where he, just sort of hangs out until he's like, all right, I guess I gotta get up and, go eat something else. This is sort of like me in college, essentially. But the moving forward from there, where it moves from that, and then it moves into them slingshotting into the black hole where they're trying to get Silver Surfer into while she's chasing them, was so tense. It looked so much like Interstellar. And you know why it was so brilliant? It was, for me, because this could have easily been written just as like a chase scene, the escape scene. But it's all done while Sue Storm is giving birth, because Galactus kind of makes it happen to an extent. And all while this is happening is while she's also sort of, having contractions and in that spaceship, and it's sort of a beat the clock type of thing. And it was genuinely stressful. I really thought that was so well handled and so well executed, and I kind of couldn't believe it. It was definitely the standout action scene for me, and I thought it was so well done. I thought it was so tense. And going out of this, there's going to be like, some people are like, oh, what's the YouTube scene? What's the standout scene? For me, it was that. For me, it was bar none that. But what also made it work is also you kind of have to watch it within context of the rest of the movie. But if we're going to get more into any kind of negatives, I really loved this movie a lot, to be entirely honest with you. And I'm sort of struggling to come up with them. I feel like if anything, I would say it's just a pacing thing. I sincerely felt like it's always kind of funny as a critique, though, that you say I wanted more, because how big of a critique is that I wanted more of it. But it really sort of just does go from first act to third act, and that's what we're working with. But I really could have used more of everything, but to an extent you're sort of like, is that big of a negative? Either way, I loved this movie so much, and I can't wait to see it again. I can't wait to see how they interact with everyone else in the MCU. Thinking about the context of how these characters act and who they're meeting at the end of Thunderbolts, because they probably, designated them as the world's protectors. Their world, they're probably going to, because they need help with Franklin or whatever. It's kind of hilarious that they're going to run into, Red Guardian. But Overall, yeah, so we rate things out of 5 here. I'm going to give this a pretty big score. It's pretty on brand for these characters, 4.5 out of 5. I loved this movie a lot. I didn't have a lot wrong with it. I think that it's been such a great year for superhero movies, after Captain America, which was okay. I didn't love it. But yeah, honestly, that's about it. Overall, I love this movie so much. What did you guys think of it? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Or are you somewhere between on it? I want to know. And before you go, please like, comment, and subscribe. And I will see you again soon.